The hangar hummed with high voltage. A $40 million jet gleamed under sterile lights. Victoria Langford, a ruthless CEO, stood with crossed arms, eyes cold as steel. Facing her was Nathan, a single dad in a faded technician's uniform. She pointed at the cockpit, smirking. "Fly this jet, then we'll talk." Technicians snickered. He was just a ground guy now. He didn't flinch. He looked at the landing gear, then at her. "If the regulations allow it, I'm ready." He walked past the open door. He grabbed the maintenance logs. The laughter died. The hangar went silent, waiting for him to fail spectacularly. Minutes later, the engine screamed. His name was Nathan Cole, 48 years old, with the kind of weathered face that told a story of high altitudes and deep losses. He stood with a quiet, unassuming posture, his hands resting naturally at his sides, devoid of the fidgeting nervousness that usually plagued job applicants in this hangar. His uniform was clean but worn at the elbows, a testament to real work, not management posturing. He was a single father. His entire world, the axis upon which his life spun, was his 12-year-old son, Eli. At this very moment, Eli was sitting in the small glass-walled break room reserved for technical staff, located at the far end of the hangar. He was quietly building a complex Lego set on a scratched laminate table, occasionally looking up to check on his dad through the glass. The break room smelled of vending machine coffee and industrial cleaner. Eli knew the routine. Dad fixed the planes, cleaned the planes, and checked the planes, but he didn't fly them. Not anymore. Not since the after. Nathan wasn't always a ground technician. 5 years ago, he was Captain Nathan Cole. He had logged over 6,000 command hours in heavy corporate jets. He had flown Gulfstreams, bombardiers, and citations across oceans and continents. He had navigated through monsoons in Southeast Asia, dodged surface-to-air missile zones in the Middle East, and landed on ice runways in the North Atlantic. He knew the sky better than he knew the layout of his own apartment. He knew the vibration of a stall before the stick shaker even activated. He knew the specific, high-pitched whine of a Rolls-Royce Pearl engine starting up in the cold morning air, a sound that used to be his alarm clock. He missed the camaraderie of the flight deck, the shared language of professionals who trusted each other with their lives. Now his only conversations were about cleaning supplies and shift changes. He missed the view of the sunrise from the flight levels, where the curvature of the earth was the only truth that mattered. But 5 years ago, life had hit him with turbulence he couldn't correct for. His wife passed away after a long, grueling, and heartbreaking battle with illness. Suddenly, the lifestyle of a corporate pilot, the erratic schedules, the nights spent in Tokyo while his son cried in New York, the missed school plays, the birthdays celebrated over FaceTime, became impossible. He couldn't raise a grieving boy from 40,000 feet. He couldn't be a father in absentia. He remembered the nights Eli would wake up screaming from nightmares, needing a parent to hold him, not a voice on a telephone. That was the moment Nathan grounded himself. No job was worth his son's tears. So Nathan made the choice that defined him. He didn't lose his wings. He voluntarily clipped them. He resigned from his flight status. He took a job in operations and ground testing. It paid less, significantly less. It had zero glory. But it had one thing that mattered more than anything else: a shift that ended at 4 p.m. It meant he was there to cook dinner. It meant he was there to help with math homework. It meant stability for Eli. It meant he was present. The woman standing opposite him was Victoria Langford, 40 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than Nathan's annual rent. She was the newly appointed CEO of Langford Global, a logistics conglomerate, and she had just purchased this jet, a pristine Bombardier Global 7500, to be the flagship of her fleet. She was sharp, ruthless, and efficient. She viewed people as assets or liabilities, with very little gray area in between. Victoria was in the middle of a frustrating manhunt. She was looking for a head of flight operations. She needed someone to manage the safety protocols, the crew rosters, and the maintenance schedules for her growing fleet. She needed a leader, not just a driver. She had interviewed a dozen candidates. They were all the same: retired airline captains with massive egos who wanted a retirement gig, Young hotshots in aviator sunglasses who wanted to fly fast and loose on her dime, or bureaucrats who didn't know a flap from a slat. Just yesterday, she had fired a candidate who tried to impress her with a steep bank turn during a demo flight, spilling her coffee. She was sick of adrenaline junkies. She wanted boring competence. Then Nathan's resume landed on her desk. It was an anomaly. Massive flight experience. Perfect safety record. Recommendations from Fortune 500 flight departments. But he was currently working as a ground safety advisor at the hangar she rented space from. "Mr. Cole," Victoria said, looking at the tablet in her hand, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Your file is confusing. You have 6,000 hours. You were a senior check airman. You were qualified on this very airframe type. But for the last 5 years, you've been checking tire pressure and auditing fuel logs." "Why?" Nathan met her gaze evenly. He didn't blink. "I prioritize stability, Ms. Langford. Ground operations allow me to control my schedule. My son needs me at home, not in a hotel room in Dubai." Victoria didn't like that answer. In her world, ambition was the only currency. If you had a talent and you weren't using it to conquer the world, you were wasting it. She suspected he had lost his nerve. She suspected he was rusty. She suspected he was looking for a desk job to hide from the pressure of the cockpit because he couldn't handle the heat anymore. "I need a head of operations who understands the reality of this aircraft," Victoria said, her voice sharp, cutting through the hangar noise. "Not someone who remembers how it used to feel 5 years ago. Aviation changes fast, Mr. Cole. Muscles atrophy, instincts fade. Theory is useless to me. I need instinct." She looked at the jet. She looked at Nathan. She decided to test him. She decided to shatter the polite interview facade and see if the pilot was still in there, or if he really was just a ground tech now. The hangar was quiet, save for the distant rhythmic hum of a ventilation fan high in the rafters. The maintenance crew had stopped their work, sensing the tension. They knew Nathan as the quiet guy who double-checked everything, the guy who never let a sloppy rivet pass inspection, the guy who ate lunch alone with his kid. They didn't know he used to be a captain. They didn't know he used to outrank everyone in the room. Victoria walked over to the aircraft stairs. The Global 7500 loomed above them, a massive, beautiful piece of engineering. She ran her hand along the handrail, testing the surface. "You say you used to fly," Victoria said, turning back to him, her heels clicking on the concrete. "But used to doesn't land a $60 million asset in a crosswind. Used to doesn't handle an engine failure at V1. Nathan remained silent. He knew where this was going. He had seen executives like her before, people who treated aviation like a game of poker, trying to bluff their way to dominance, confusing aggression with leadership. "You applied for the safety advisor role," Victoria continued, pacing around him. "But safety comes from mastery. If you can't handle this bird, you can't tell my crews how to fly it. I don't hire coaches who can't play the game." She gestured grandly to the open cockpit door, the dark interior beckoning. "Fly it first, then we'll talk." It was a challenge. It was a dare. It was almost an insult. The surrounding technicians exchanged glances. Some smirked, covering their mouths. They expected Nathan to stammer, to make an excuse about his license being expired, to admit that he was rusty and back down. They expected him to be embarrassed. Nathan didn't move toward the stairs. He didn't rush to prove himself. He didn't let his ego take the wheel. He didn't smile. He stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the aircraft exterior. He looked at the pitot tubes, checking for covers. He looked at the static ports. He looked at the chocks on the wheels. He checked the windsock hanging limp outside the hangar door. "Under whose authority?" Nathan asked quietly. Victoria blinked. She paused mid-step. "Excuse me? Who is the pilot in command, PIC?" Nathan asked, his voice steady, authoritative, and projecting clearly across the distance. "This aircraft is currently in a maintenance cycle. I am an applicant. I am not on your insurance policy as a flight crew member. I cannot legally sit in the left seat and take command of this aircraft without a designated PIC on board to supervise. If I touch those controls without authorization, I violate FAA regulations, and I void your insurance." The silence in the hangar deepened. The mechanics stopped wiping their wrenches. They had never heard anyone speak to Ms. Langford like that. They expected him to be fired on the spot, escorted out by security, but Nathan stood there, an unmovable object against her irresistible force, grounded by the weight of regulations written in blood. Victoria paused. She hadn't expected a lecture on insurance and maritime law. She expected bravado. She expected him to jump at the chance to touch the controls of a machine he clearly missed. The company's chief pilot, Captain Miller, stepped out from the shadows of the wing. He was a good man, gray-haired, tired of the CEO's theatrics, but respectful of the hierarchy. He was holding a tablet. "I am the PIC, Ms. Langford," Captain Miller said, his voice calm. "The aircraft is prepped for a functional check flight. We were going up anyway to test the pressurization system. Flight plan is filed." Nathan nodded to Captain Miller. It was a nod of mutual respect between professionals, acknowledging the chain of command. "If Captain Miller retains command," Nathan said, turning back to Victoria, his gaze unwavering, "and if he designates me as his second in command for this flight leg, I can legally operate the aircraft from the right seat, but I will not fly solo, and I will not fly without a pre-flight briefing. That is reckless, and I don't do reckless." Victoria stared at him. He was refusing her direct order to just fly it, but he was doing it in a way that made her feel reckless for asking. He was outmaneuvering her with regulations. "Are you scared, Mr. Cole?" Victoria pressed, stepping closer, trying to find a crack in his armor. "Are you hiding behind the rule book because you've forgotten how to feel the plane?" Nathan walked over to the checklist board hanging by the nose gear. He picked it up. He checked the maintenance release signature. He checked the tire pressure logs. "Ms. Langford," Nathan said, looking her in the eye, holding the clipboard like a shield. "There are old pilots, and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. I don't fly to impress you. I fly to get back on the ground safely so I can see my son. If you want a circus act, hire a stuntman. If you want a safety director, let me do this right." He turned to Captain Miller. "Captain, I'd like to review the weight and balance data before we board. I noticed some heavy cargo pallets near the rear bulkhead earlier." Victoria felt a flicker of annoyance, but also something else, a begrudging respect, curiosity. "Fine," she snapped, waving her hand. "Do it your way. But if you fumble the takeoff, if you give me a bumpy ride, the interview is over. I'll find someone who actually wants to fly." Nathan didn't answer. He was already reading the logs, calculating fuel loads in his head. 10 minutes later, Nathan was strapped into the right seat of the cockpit. The smell of the flight deck, leather, avionics, cooling fans, and faint ozone hit him like a physical memory. It felt like coming home. It felt like putting on a glove that fit perfectly. But he didn't let himself get emotional. Emotion was a distraction. Distraction killed pilots. Captain Miller sat in the left seat. Victoria, breaking protocol to observe, sat in the jump seat behind them, wearing a headset. She wanted to see his hands shake. She wanted to see him hesitate. She wanted to see if the ground guy could handle the speed. Nathan adjusted his seat. He adjusted the pedals. His hands moved with a fluid, practiced economy. He didn't fumble for switches. He knew exactly where every button was on the Global 7500. His muscle memory woke up from a 5-year coma. The tactile click of the switches was a language he hadn't spoken in years, but his tongue remembered every syllable. "Checklist," Nathan said. His voice on the intercom was deep, calm, and robotic. It was the voice of command. "Hydraulics," Miller responded. "Checked. Pressure's nominal, 3,000 psi. Fuel pumps, on, crossfeed closed. Trim." Nathan paused. He looked at the digital trim indicators on the central screen. "Captain," Nathan said, his voice cutting in, "the load sheet indicates we have empty ferry tanks, but the CG, center of gravity computer, is showing a 2% aft bias. Did we load the flyaway kit in the rear bay?" Miller checked his notes, surprised. "Yes. Mechanics threw the heavy tool kit in the back for the test. It's not secured properly in the weight and balance calculation," Nathan said, tapping the screen. "It's within limits, barely, but it will make the rotation sensitive. If we rotate at standard VR speed, the nose will pitch up faster than expected. It won't be smooth. It will feel sloppy to the passengers. It could trigger a stick shaker warning if we aren't careful. Victoria rolled her eyes in the jump seat. We're talking about a toolbox. Just fly the plane. Stop making excuses. Nathan ignored her. He looked at Miller. Suggest we adjust the stabilizer trim forward by 0.5 units to compensate for the aft load. It will smooth out the rotation and give us better authority on the climb out. Miller looked at Nathan with genuine surprise. Most pilots wouldn't catch that subtle discrepancy until they were already in the air, fighting the yoke to keep the nose down. Good catch, Nathan. Set trim minus 0.5. Nathan adjusted the wheel. Click, click. Trim set. Ready for engine start. The engines whined to life. The massive Rolls-Royce Pearl engines stabilized. Nathan watched the interstage turbine temperature, ITT, gauges like a hawk, looking for a hot start. He monitored the hydraulic pressure fluctuations during the flap test, noting a slight delay in the number 2 actuator, a detail he filed away for later. They taxied to the runway. Victoria watched Nathan's hands. They weren't gripping the controls tightly with white knuckles. They were resting gently, fingertips only. He wasn't wrestling the machine. He was communicating with it. Global 750, cleared for takeoff. Runway 27, the tower crackled. Nathan pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared. The acceleration pressed them back into the seats, a massive, invisible hand shoving them toward the sky. Victoria braced herself. She expected him to yank the plane off the ground to show its power. She expected a steep, aggressive cowboy climb to prove he was tough. Instead, she felt almost nothing. V1, Nathan called out. Rotate. Nathan pulled back on the stick. The movement was microscopic. The nose lifted, but it didn't jerk. It floated. The aircraft unglued itself from the runway with such gentleness that Victoria didn't even realize they were airborne until the altimeter started spinning rapidly. Because of the trim adjustment Nathan had insisted on, the plane didn't pitch up violently. It climbed on a perfect, steady rail. He retracted the gear. He retracted the flaps. He hand flew the departure. He wasn't using the autopilot yet. He was keeping the aircraft exactly, precisely on the flight director crosshairs. Departure. Global 750 is passing 3,000 for 10,000, Nathan said to ATC. His voice was bored. It was the most boring, professional voice Victoria had ever heard. He banked the aircraft into a turn. He coordinated the rudder perfectly. The ball on the turn coordinator didn't move a millimeter off center. Victoria watched the vertical speed indicator. It was pinned at a steady climb. No fluctuations, no hunting for altitude. He monitored the primary flight display, PFD, with a zen-like focus. He anticipated a thermal updraft before they even hit it, correcting with a microscopic twitch of his wrist that smoothed out the bump before the passengers could even feel it. He was painting a masterpiece in the sky, using aerodynamics as his brush. He flew for 20 minutes. He performed a steep turn. He performed a stall recovery simulation. Everything was slow, deliberate, and mathematically perfect. He didn't look back at her for approval. He didn't smile. He was working. Heading back to base, Miller said. You're landing, Nathan. This was the real test. The Global 7500 was a big bird. Landing it smooth was an art form. Nathan lined up with the runway. There was a crosswind. Victoria saw the windsock stiffening. Nathan crabbed the plane. He fought the wind with tiny, rapid corrections that Victoria could barely see. The runway rushed up. Flare. He held it off. He waited. He waited. Touchdown. The wheels kissed the concrete so softly that the only indication they had landed was the automatic deployment of the spoilers. No thud, no bounce, no screech. He applied the brakes smoothly. He didn't jerk their heads forward. They taxied back to the hangar. The engines whined down. Nathan took off his headset. He turned to Captain Miller. Flight complete. Parking brake set. The silence in the cockpit was heavy. Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt. She sat there for a moment, processing. She had expected a show. She had expected him to loop the plane or do a combat takeoff to prove his virility. She expected arrogance. Instead, she got surgery. They walked down the air stairs. The ground crew was waiting, expecting a story. Nathan didn't high-five anyone. He walked straight to the nose gear and patted the fuselage, a habit from his old days. He turned to Victoria and Captain Miller. "The aircraft flies beautifully," Nathan said, his voice professional. Victoria crossed her arms. "That's it. That's your report. You haven't flown in 5 years and all you have to say is, 'It flies beautifully'?" Nathan pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "No," Nathan said. "The left brake pedal has a spongy feel at the bottom of the travel. It feels like a seal is weeping slightly on the return line. It won't fail today, but it will fail in a month if you don't address it now. And the radar altimeter flickered twice on the approach. It needs a calibration check. Also your pre-flight checklist." He looked at Miller apologetically. "It puts the flow of the hydraulic check after the engine start. That's inefficient. If you find a leak, you have to shut down and restart. It wastes fuel. I recommend moving the hydraulic static check to the before start flow. It will save you about $50,000 a year in fuel and cycle costs. And I noticed the number 3 hydraulic pump is cycling a fraction of a second slower than the others," Nathan added, tapping his notebook. "It's within limits, but it indicates a filter that's starting to clog. Change it now during the A check, or it will fail when you're halfway to London, grounding you for 2 days." Victoria stared at him. He wasn't talking about his flying skills. He wasn't bragging about the smooth landing. He was talking about saving her money and improving efficiency. He was talking about the boring stuff, the stuff that actually mattered. She realized with a jolt that she had surrounded herself with yes men who would have ignored that pump just to keep to the schedule. She didn't have a team. She had an audience. Nathan wasn't part of the audience. "You didn't try to impress me," Victoria said accusingly. "You flew that like a bus driver." Nathan put his notebook away. "A boring flight is a safe flight, Miss Langford," Nathan said. "If the passengers notice the pilot is doing something wrong. My job isn't to be noticed. My job is to be forgotten so you can do business. You pay me to be invisible, not to be a star." Victoria looked at him. "You hesitated on the tarmac. You asked for the PIC. You checked the insurance. I thought you were insecure. I thought you were afraid." Nathan looked at her, his eyes hard. "I hesitated because I am responsible. A pilot who jumps into a cockpit without knowing who is in command is a liability. I don't break rules to look cool. I follow rules so my son still has a father at the end of the day." The mention of his son hung in the air. Victoria looked toward the break room. She saw Eli, the 12-year-old boy, press his face against the glass, waving at his dad. Nathan waved back, his stoic face breaking into a warm, genuine smile. Victoria realized she had been looking for the wrong thing. She had been looking for a top gun. She had been looking for someone who would swagger into the boardroom and charm the investors. But she didn't need a performer. She needed a guardian. She needed someone who would say no to her when it wasn't safe. She needed someone who cared about hydraulic bubbles and fuel costs. She needed someone who put the mission above the ego. "I don't want you as a safety consultant," Victoria said abruptly. Nathan sighed. "I understand. I'm not flashy enough. I'll go back to the maintenance bay." "No," Victoria said. "I want you as my director of flight operations." Nathan paused. He blinked. "That's, a senior executive role. That manages the entire fleet." "It is," Victoria said. "I need someone who isn't impressed by me. I need someone who checks the trim before they push the throttle. I need an adult in the room. I have enough cowboys." Nathan looked at Eli. "The hours. I can't do the late nights, Miss Langford. I can't do the Tokyo trips. I can't leave him." "The hours are Victoria said. "You run the department from the ground. You set the standards. You hire the pilots. You fire the cowboys. You fly when you want to keep your hand in. But your main job is to make sure my fleet runs like you just flew. Boring, safe, efficient." She extended her hand. "And you leave at 4 p.m. every day. If anyone gives you trouble about leaving to pick up your son, send them to me. I'll fire them." "And Nathan," Victoria added, her voice serious, "I want you to rewrite the entire training manual. I want every pilot in this company to fly with your discipline. I don't care if they have 10,000 hours or 10. If they can't fly boring, they don't fly for Langford Global. Nathan looked at her hand. He realized she wasn't mocking him anymore. She was respecting him. He shook her hand firmly. I'll start Monday, but we're rewriting that checklist first thing, and we're fixing that brake pedal. Victoria smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all day. I expect nothing less. Nathan walked back to the break room. He took off his technician's vest. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He wasn't just a ground tech. He walked in and Eli hugged him. Did you fly the big plane, Dad? Eli asked, eyes wide. Yeah, buddy. Nathan smiled, picking up his backpack. I flew it. Was it fast? Did you do a loop? Nathan chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. No, Eli, it was very, very boring. Just the way we like it. The takeoff hadn't changed the jet. The jet was just a machine. But the takeoff had changed the way the world looked at Nathan. And more importantly, it reminded Nathan that he hadn't lost his wings. He had just been saving them for the right flight. If you believe that true calmness and responsibility are worth more than showing off, hit that subscribe button to follow more stories of real professionalism. Tell us in the comments, do you prefer a leader who acts fast or one who thinks first? Which one would you trust with your life?